Welcome to International Management, the podcast that breaks down the core challenges and strategies of global business. Based on Orlando Casabon's scripts for his international management class, each episode offers practical insights, clear strategies, real-world examples, and expert guidance to help you navigate complex global landscapes. For additional resources, visit casabon.com. Now, let's dive into the essentials of international management.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into this fascinating script I found by Orlando about international financial management.
Oh yeah, I had a chance to look that over. It's pretty interesting stuff.
I know, right? You wouldn't think managing money across borders would be so, exciting.
Right. But when you think about it, it's like this whole hidden world of decisions and strategies and risks.
Absolutely. And that's what I love about this script. Orlando does a great job of breaking down those complexities and, making it all understandable, even for someone like me who's not exactly a financial whiz.
Yeah, no, totally. Like one of the first things that jumped out at me was how it emphasizes that international finance, it's way more than just exchanging currencies, right?
Yeah, it's about so many other things like assessing the creditworthiness of your international partners and figuring out which currency to use for a transaction and then making sure you get paid securely.
Yeah, exactly. It's a whole web of strategic decisions.
Yeah. And that brings us to the whole world of payment methods, right? I mean, when you're dealing with businesses across the globe, how do you even make sure you get paid?
Right. And, the script actually lays out this whole spectrum of payment methods, from the super simple to the really quite intricate ones.
I love that part. On one end, you have pay me up front, or prepayment, as they call it in the script, which I guess is, great for the exporter, but pretty risky for the importer, right?
Exactly. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have things like open account, which is basically like an IOU. It's all built on trust.
So that's for when you've been working with someone for a long time, you have that relationship, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And then somewhere in between, you have these really interesting mechanisms like documentary collection.
Yeah, that's where banks come in as intermediaries, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of fascinating by the whole process.
Yeah, it is. And within documentary collection, you've even got different levels of security like site drafts versus time drafts. And then those even involve trade acceptances and bank acceptances it gets.
Oh, don't even get me started on letters of credit. Those sounded like a whole world unto themselves.
Yeah, they are. But they're also really important because they provide this financial guarantee that the importer will only pay once specific conditions are met.
So it's like a way to reduce risk for both sides.
Exactly. And the script goes into detail about the different types of letters of credit, like advised, confirmed, irrevocable, revocable. They each have different levels of security depending on what the parties need.
It's amazing how much thought goes into all of this stuff. And I haven't even mentioned currency risk yet. Orlando calls it a three-headed monster in the script. And for good reason.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. You've got transaction risk, which is all about how changes in exchange rates can impact a specific deal.
Right. And then there's translation risk, which is how those same currency fluctuations mess with the company's financial statements.
Yeah, and then looming over everything, you've got economic risk, which is about the long-term effects of currency changes on a company's competitiveness. So it's like
a whole other level of complexity.
It is. And one thing that really helped me understand translation risk was that example in the script about General Motors and its British subsidiary.
Oh, yeah. That was a good one. Basically, it shows how a shift in exchange rates can create what they call a paper loss, even if no actual money is actually lost.
Right. It all comes down to how those numbers look on the balance sheet and how those accounting rules work.
So it's not just about managing actual cash flow, it's about managing perceptions and expectations too.
Exactly. And that's why companies use all sorts of strategies to manage these risks.
Yeah. The script talks about things like hedging with derivatives, which is this way of locking in an exchange rate to protect yourself from sudden swings. And then
and there's also the strategy of trying to match your revenues and expenses in the same currency.
Right, so the fluctuations don't hit you as hard.
Exactly. It's all about minimizing your exposure.
So we've got payments, we've got risks. But what about just keeping the lights on day to day? How do multinational companies actually manage all their money on a global scale?
Right. So that's where working capital management comes in. It's this whole other area of international finance that the script dives into.
It's all about efficiency.
Yeah.
Making sure your money is working as hard as possible.
Exactly. It's about minimizing the amount of money tied up in day-to-day operations so you can reduce costs and, increase profitability.
One of the techniques the script mentions is netting, which I thought was pretty clever.
Oh yeah, netting is super useful. It's basically a way to reduce the number of times a company has to convert currencies, which can save a ton of money on transaction fees.
Yeah, I can imagine those fees adding up quickly, especially for a big company.
For sure. And the script explains how companies can use netting between just two subsidiaries, that's bilateral netting, or even involve three or more in what's called multilateral netting.
And then there was that example with Samsung, right?
Yeah. Samsung, with its subsidiaries in Mexico, the UK, and South Korea, by routing their payments strategically, they can significantly reduce those currency conversion costs.
So it's like a giant financial puzzle, figuring out the most efficient way to move money around the globe.
Totally. And it's not just about efficiency, it's also about strategy, because those decisions can affect a company's overall tax burden and even its exposure to political risks.
Which brings us to another fascinating concept that Orlando covers in his script: capital budgeting. It's basically how companies decide where to invest their money.
Right. And for international companies, it's way more complex than just looking at potential profits, because you have to factor in all these additional risks and considerations.
Yeah, like political instability or changes in regulations. The script talks about a few different methods companies use to evaluate these international investments. And I have to admit, some of it went over my head.
Yeah, it can get pretty technical. But basically, they use tools like net present value, NPV, which takes into account the time value of money.
So it's like looking at not just how much money you might make, but when you'll make it.
Right. And then there's the internal rate of return, IRR, which is all about figuring out the minimum rate of return you need for an investment to be worthwhile.
And of course, there's the classic payback period, which is basically how long it takes to recoup your initial investment.
But the script emphasizes that with international investments, it's not just about the numbers. You have to consider things like the currency you're using for your analysis, and whether to view each project in isolation or as part of a bigger global strategy.
It's like a giant multidimensional chess game. So we've got payments, risks, optimizing cash flow, making investment decisions. But how do these international companies actually get the money to fund all of this? It can't all be about taking out loans, right?
Right. The script actually breaks down the different sources of capital available to international businesses, and it's pretty interesting. They basically fall into two categories: external sources and internal sources.
External sources, I'm guessing that's like banks and stuff?
Yeah, exactly. Things like investment banks, stock markets, debt markets, and even those kind of mysterious swap markets.
Swap markets, I may have to Google that one later.
Haha. Yeah, they're a whole other world. And then you've got internal sources, which is basically using the cash generated from a company's existing operations to fund growth.
Makes sense. So it's all about finding the right mix of funding sources, and I imagine that gets even more complicated when you're dealing with all those international risks and uncertainties.
Totally. It's a balancing act, minimizing the cost of capital while also managing risks like currency fluctuations and political instability.
Speaking of complex financial maneuvers, the script also dives into this fascinating concept called transfer pricing. It sounded kind of dry at first, but then I realized it's actually really strategic.
Oh yeah, transfer pricing is super interesting. It's basically about how companies set prices for goods and services that are exchanged between their own subsidiaries.
Yeah, but here's the thing. It's not as simple as it sounds, because those prices can actually be used to optimize a company's global tax burden.
Right. The script even gives this simplified example showing how a company can adjust the price of an export to shift profits from a high-tax country to a low-tax one.
I know. It's like playing the global game, right? Using those accounting rules to your advantage.
Totally. But it's not all about tax avoidance. The script points out that there are different approaches to transfer pricing, like market-based approaches where companies use comparable market prices, and then you have these non-market-based approaches,
Which are more about achieving specific goals.
Right.
Like reducing tariffs or repatriating profits that are stuck in a country with strict currency controls.
Exactly. It's a powerful tool, but it's also one that can be misused, and the script does acknowledge some of the potential downsides.
Yeah, like all those management meetings and negotiations to figure out those prices. And then there's the risk of creating tension between subsidiaries if one feels like it's getting a raw deal compared to another.
It's a balancing act for sure, weighing the potential benefits against the potential risks and complications.
Whew. I feel like my brain is full after that whirlwind tour of international financial management. From payment methods and currency risks to optimizing cash flow and all those strategic maneuvers. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, no kidding. And we've only just scratched the surface. International finance is such a vast and ever-evolving field, there's always something new to learn.
But even just this glimpse into the world of global finance, I think it's been eye-opening.
Absolutely. And I think what's really important to remember is that these aren't just abstract concepts, they have real-world implications for businesses, economies, and ultimately for all of us.
That's a great point. I think this script has really highlighted the interconnectedness of the global financial system, how decisions made in one part of the world can ripple out and affect people everywhere.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so important to understand how these systems work, even on a basic level.
Because once you see the connections, you can start to ask those bigger questions about fairness, sustainability, and the role of finance in shaping the world we want to live in.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. But don't worry, we're not done yet.
We've only just scratched the surface. In part 2, we're going to dive even deeper into the world of international finance, exploring those ethical and social implications we just touched on.
It's going to be a fascinating discussion, so stay tuned. Welcome back to the deep dive. So we spent part 1 unpacking all those complex mechanics of international finance, the payment systems, the currency risks, those capital budgeting tools.
Yeah, it's a lot to wrap your head around,
Yeah,
but I think we made some good progress in understanding the basics.
definitely. But now I think it's time to zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture, like how do these financial decisions actually play out in the real world? What are the impacts?
Right, because it's one thing to understand how transfer pricing works in theory, but it's another to see how it actually affects people's lives,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And that's what I appreciate about Orlando's script. It doesn't shy away from some of those more controversial aspects of international finance.
Yeah, like the whole debate around transfer pricing and its impact on government revenues.
Right. We talked about how companies can use it to shift profits to low-tax countries, but that obviously has implications for the countries where those profits would have been taxed otherwise.
Yeah, less tax revenue for those governments means less money for things like healthcare, education, infrastructure, all that stuff.
Exactly. And that's where the ethical considerations come in.
Because on the one hand, companies have a responsibility to their shareholders to maximize profits, right? And managing their tax burden is part of that.
Right. It's a legal obligation in many cases.
But on the other hand, there's this growing expectation that corporations should also contribute their fair share to the societies they operate in.
It's a tough balance to strike, and there's no easy answer.
Yeah, it's a real dilemma. And speaking of dilemmas, the script also mentions tax havens, those countries with super low tax rates that attract businesses looking to, well, minimize their global tax bills.
Yeah, and again, using tax havens can be perfectly legal, but there are definitely some criticisms surrounding them.
Yeah, like the argument that they contribute to global inequality by basically draining resources from countries that need them most.
It raises some tough questions about fairness and whether the current global tax system is really working as intended.
Because ideally, you want a system that encourages investment and economic growth, but you also want it to be fair and equitable, right?
Absolutely. It's about finding that sweet spot where everyone benefits, not just a select few.
And it's not just governments and corporations that are affected by all of this, right? These financial decisions have ripple effects that reach everyday people like you and me.
Oh, absolutely. Take currency fluctuations, for example.
Yeah, we talked about how those changes in exchange rates can impact a company's bottom line.
Right. But they also affect consumers. If your local currency weakens against the dollar, suddenly everything you import becomes more expensive.
Which means higher prices at the grocery store, at the gas pump, you name it.
It can make it much harder for people to afford basic necessities, especially in countries with weaker economies.
And it can squeeze household budgets, leading to all sorts of downstream effects.
Exactly. And these currency fluctuations can be really challenging for small and medium-sized businesses, too.
Yeah, because they might not have the same resources as larger corporations to hedge against those risks.
Right. They're much more vulnerable to those sudden shifts in the global economy.
One thing that really struck me as we were going through the script is just how complex and interconnected this whole global financial system really is.
Oh, yeah, it's mind-boggling sometimes.
And honestly, it can feel pretty overwhelming, even intimidating.
I get that. The sheer complexity of these systems can make them feel very opaque, like they're operating in this black box that's inaccessible to everyday people.
And that feeling of powerlessness can lead to apathy.
Right.
Or even distrust in the whole system.
Exactly. But that's why I think conversations like this are so important.
Yeah. Because even just starting to understand how these systems work, even on a basic level, can be empowering.
It helps us see the connections between those big global decisions and our own lives.
And it helps us ask those critical questions and demand more transparency and accountability from the people and institutions that are making those decisions.
Right. It's not about becoming financial experts overnight. It's about becoming informed citizens who can engage in these conversations and push for a more just and sustainable system.
So, with that in mind, let's move on to part 3, where we'll explore what we can actually do with this newfound knowledge. How can we take action and make a difference in this complex world of international finance? Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So we've explored all the ins and outs of international financial management, but now for the big question, what can we actually do with all this knowledge?
Right. It's easy to feel kind of helpless when you're talking about these huge global systems.
Totally. Like, I understand how transfer pricing works now, but what can I do about it?
Well, I think one of the key takeaways from Orlando's script is that corporations play a massive role in shaping these systems.
So it's not just about governments and policies.
Exactly. And that's where we come in as consumers.
So it's about being conscious consumers, right?
Right.
Like choosing to support businesses that align with our values.
Precisely. We can choose to buy from companies that prioritize ethical sourcing, fair labor practices, things like that.
And responsible tax strategies.
Yes. It's about putting our money where our mouth is.
I like that. Using our wallets as a form of activism.
Exactly. Voting for a better world with every purchase.
Okay, that makes sense for individual companies, but what about the bigger systemic issues like tax havens and the lack of transparency in the global financial system? Those feel kind of impossible to tackle.
I hear you. Those are huge challenges, and it can feel overwhelming.
Right. Like, where do you even begin?
Well, the first step is awareness, right? We're doing that right now. By understanding how these systems work, we can start having more informed conversations.
So talk to our friends and family, post on social media.
Exactly. Raise awareness about how these financial decisions impact local economies, global inequality, all of that.
It's about starting a ripple effect.
Yes. Even small actions can contribute to a larger movement.
I was actually doing some reading, and there are all these organizations working to push for greater transparency in the financial system.
Absolutely. They're doing amazing work, shedding light on tax havens, holding corporations accountable.
So we can support those organizations.
Yes. Donate, volunteer, spread the word. We can also advocate for policy changes, push for greater regulation.
But we're not just passive bystanders in this. We can actually make a difference.
Exactly. It all starts with recognizing that we do have agency and our collective voices can create change.
Yeah. I'm feeling a little less overwhelmed and a little more hopeful now.
That's what we like to hear. It's complex, for sure, but it's not hopeless.
I think Orlando's script, even though it's all about the mechanics of international finance, it kind of reminds you that these are ultimately human systems, right?
Yes. Human created, and therefore human changeable.
We can reshape them to better serve humanity.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's up to all of us to demand a more just, transparent, and sustainable global financial system.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into international financial management.
I feel like we've only scratched the surface, but it's been a great discussion.
Huge thanks to Orlando for that amazing script that sparked this whole conversation.
And thank you for listening.
We hope you enjoyed this journey into the complex but fascinating world of global finance.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about how these systems work, the more we can push for a better world.
Until next time, keep diving deep and keep questioning everything.